Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's NU Forum on Abortion. I'm Dr. Mike Walsh of the NU Department of Philosophy, and I'll be moderating this discussion. I'd like to introduce our panelists, first of all. Representing the pro-choice side, we have Isabella Aiu and Ellen Rajnisz. And representing the pro-life side, we have Joseph Tricarico and Moira Werner. The way that this will proceed today, we'll begin with a representative from each side providing a brief explanation of their position. The discussion itself will be broken up into 4 segments, 2 for each side. Panelists will have 3 minutes to respond to a question or an issue. That'll be followed by a 3-minute reply from the opposing side. And then the segment will close with the first panelist getting 3 minutes for the final word in that segment. By a coin flip before the discussion, the pro-choice side won, so they have 2.5 minutes to lead off. Ellen, if you'd like to begin.
Great. Thank you all for attending. So the cultural and societal differences between states are vast. Passing laws is tedious when consensus is hard to reach. In the case of autonomy over contraception and access to abortion, women and people of color in states that severely restrict access to women's health centers, states that often have even less female representation in their legislatures, are disproportionately affected. In 2017, the monthly maximum for temporary assistance to needy families in Alabama was $215 for a family of 3. This year, the Supreme Court decided that an Alabama law that banned abortion in nearly all cases, including cases of rape or incest, unless the mother's life was seriously compromised, and threatened doctors with up to 99 years in prison, was unconstitutional. Not only would this law have been in direct violation of the precedent set in Roe v. Wade and others after, it perpetuates the cycle of poverty and the racial contract in Alabama, where in 2016, a federal court struck down a law requiring doctors who performed abortions to have hospital admittance privileges. This is why access to legal abortion and the clinics that provide them is a federal issue and not a state one. This is what's at stake. There are currently more than 400,000 children in the American foster care system, and without addressing the systemic problems surrounding equitable access to healthcare, comprehensive sex education, the epidemic of violence against women, and the politicization of abortion as a partisan tool that have led us to this point, we cannot entertain religious-based arguments against a woman's right to choose.
Okay, thank you very much. Joseph, I believe you'll be articulating the pro-life side.
Yes, sir.
Anytime.
So the basic view that we hold is one that is deeply rooted in science, that life begins at conception. That at the point that sperm fertilizes the egg, a unique person is formed. This person is certainly living as they carry out all of the life processes. You can consider the fertilization of Moira. Even at the point of fertilization, she was growing, she was responding to stimuli. She converted energy from chemical reactions. She had a unique genetic code. And she was, and continues to be, cellular in composition, just as all living things must be. She wasn't as living. It is because of this that we hold the position that there is no point after conception that you can intentionally end the life of another human being. I would like to clarify that it is our position that abortion is acceptable when it only comes about with the intention of saving another person's life. We do not hold the position that a mother should have to sacrifice her own life for that of her children's. Of course, there are women who do decide to do this, and that is heroic. But the women who don't make that decision would not be doing anything wrong, and we don't consider them to be doing anything wrong. If you were to draw a line at a point after conception where abortion is valid before that point, then there is no reasoning that you could provide for where that line is that would not also apply to people outside the womb. Any position that supports abortion at any point, therefore, must be either inconsistent or arbitrary. Many arguments for abortion stem from size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, convenience, and circumstances of conception. These positions seek to limit personhood and marginalize a sector of our human family. If we truly believe in equality for all, then our notion of personhood cannot stem from what someone can do, what their abilities are, how they were conceived, or what they were born into. It should simply stem from what they are, which is human. Preborn humans deserve protection under the law, and women deserve better than abortion. The only thing that gives us value at all is our humanity. This is the only thing that all of us have in common. We are all equally human, and therefore we are all equally valuable.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. All right, as I said before, we'll begin with a segment led off by the pro-choice side. So the question I have for the pro-choice side to respond to lead this off, we may grant that a woman has a right to decide how her body is used. And while this may justify an abortion in cases of rape, incest, even a threat to the mother's life, it isn't clear how this allows for abortion as a result of a pregnancy that came from consensual sex. Would you care to explain how abortion would be permissible if it results from a pregnancy that came about via consensual sex? So who on the pro-choice side would like to speak to that particular issue or question?
Yes.
Okay. Bella, go right ahead.
So, I'd like to remind everyone that women don't choose to be in situations where they cannot consent, especially when it comes to sex. And when we start to draw the line and have to specify between rape and consensual sex, it's basically saying that you get a free pass because you were raped. Congrats. And that's not the case at all. There are multiple women out there who have had consensual sexual experiences and have regretted it and look back and say, that wasn't consensual after all, I guess. And there's nothing wrong with women changing their mind about how they feel about that, especially when they are impregnated and it impacts their lives so much. Not only is that an extremely traumatic experience, but it is also a fact that abortion is a traumatic experience, but it's a necessary medical treatment that a woman chooses for the safety and sake of her own well-being. Let's not forget that going through child labor is a traumatic experience as well, but it's a necessary trauma for those who choose it, just like abortion. The issue here is taking the right to choose. And using rape in that way and like specifying consensual rape, this question, there's no reason to draw the line here because it's just as morally impermissible either way to keep a woman from choosing to have an abortion. So let's say the woman in question here can't prove that she was raped and is still forced to go through with the pregnancy under the law, because we are drawing these lines on what is permissible or a permissible circumstance for an abortion. In that situation, she wouldn't have the right to consent not once, but twice, especially since rape alone is already difficult to prove and discouraged for women to report. That in and of itself is morally impermissible, backing women into this corner. The law can't place an objective standard on such a subjective matter because every woman's conditions, circumstances, and choices are different, but we should have the right to choose how we use our body. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Would someone from the pro-life side care to respond?
I
would
could
like to
maybe.
respond, if I may, Joseph, if that's okay.
Okay, Moira, go right ahead.
So I would just like to ask you a question, Bella. I don't understand where you're drawing your line in terms of consent. Is it possible to consent to an act in the moment and then days later decide that that consent at the time was invalid?
You can take back consent at any point of sex, before, during, and after.
Yes, I see that you can, of course, take back consent during. You are at any point able to stop consenting to whatever's happening, saying stop. But it seems to me that days after the fact, it's no longer relevant in a sense because the act is already completed. Like
Yes,
that applies to other things.
yes, but when a woman is impregnated from a situation like that, consensual or not, she should still have the right to choose how that affects her, especially since another person impregnates her.
Well, then I would ask how you feel about the fact that if a woman chooses to have an abortion after, say, a case of rape, you mentioned that rape is difficult to prove, which is a massive problem for women. That's something that I feel very strongly about, and it angers a lot of women, as it should. But having a pregnancy would be a way to prove the rape. So do you not think that it would possibly be a good thing to maintain the pregnancy and then perhaps enforced pregnancy on the part of the rapist could be an additional charge that they would have to suffer for in prison?
Okay. I think that when you consider the historical aspect of our society, the way that we consider consent, the way that we, there is an epidemic of violence against women. I think you just said you can agree to that. So I think it's unwise to say that you can't take back consent days after the fact because hindsight is 2020, and we are not taught from an early age what consent should look like. So I think that I think that a woman kind of deciding after the fact that probably was not as consensual as it felt in the moment is something that's valid and something that needs to be explored more in our education system and how we talk about these things with women and with men. I also think that to your question regarding doesn't this prove a rape? No, not necessarily, because it is still a he said. In most cases, in many states, it is still a he said versus she said. All that's proving is that there was DNA. It doesn't necessarily prove, a date rape scenario or a scenario of questionable consent. Also, the point stands that many rapes go unreported because of the societal stigma that's attached to being raped, as well as carrying as being pregnant. Rape is also one of the most, if not the most traumatic things, violation of your body that can happen to a woman, forcing a woman to carry that constant reminder for not only 9 months, but then given the state of our adoption within this country, for likely, this is their child now, this is their responsibility for the rest of their life. It's just continuously re-traumatizing the woman.
What I'd like to maybe add is that obviously I empathize with rape is a completely horrific thing that anyone would have to go through or having to participate in anything that they didn't consent to. But what I would view it as is, yes, the woman is a victim, 100%. It's horrific for her. Why should we add a second victim now to it? Because now there's a child. So I view those as two separate things. So there was, a rape, obviously a horrific thing. I hope, justice is done. The man is, punished to the fullest extent of the law. But now there's another person there. And I don't think that adding another victim, doing another horrific act to somebody else who wasn't involved, who's completely innocent, solves anything.
To respond to that, I would have to say that the right to a potential life should never trump the right to consent, how a human being now gets to use their body. That's just how I feel about it. And then from the stance of life, it has been ruled in court that is up to the medical professionals. It's up to the doctors making that decision. So when it comes to how long into the pregnancy or whether the fetus at that point is a victim necessarily, it shouldn't be up to us to decide, especially since that seems to lean more towards our own personal religious beliefs.
Well, I don't think anyone here is going to bring up any religious beliefs whatsoever. Neither of us have this view due to our religion. We are both religious, maybe, but I don't think that either of us will hold this view because of I just want to clarify that.
Okay, well then let me change my word choice. Sorry, not religious, but ethical or moral.
Well, but my point is that that's really what the discussion should be about. It's not about, oh, is there a rape? Is there, like in this case, in that case, like whether it was consensual or not, it comes down to, is it a child? Is it a human being? Or, because I guess maybe the question that I'd like to ask you guys is, for human, like, is there, besides in the womb, like I'm assuming you guys would view that, or I won't assume, I'll ask, you guys would view that it's not permissible to kill an innocent person? Like, we can start there, right?
Okay.
Let's make this the last word on the pro-choice side for this segment.
Okay. So obviously killing a living human is wrong. But I think that from our standpoint, the bigger moral question here is not the potential viability of a fetus in a country that has the highest rate of infant mortality in the, when compared to similar GDPs in similar countries within the world. I think that the bigger question of morality is, how are we, and this is where I think we do have a difference of opinion. The bigger question is, how are we treating the people that are here right now, not the potential viability of a future fetus? And that's where I do think that science is the question, like Bella said, the question of when a fetus is viable, when there is a potential for life there, is still something that is up for debate within the scientific community.
Okay, thank you all very much. So we're on to segment 2 now. We'll open with a question for the pro-life side. So at the beginning, when you summarized your position, you took the position that life began at conception, and you took this position on scientific grounds. How would you account for the lack of, if you believe that life begins at conception, how would you account for the lack of so many seemingly obvious human traits in, let's say, an unborn entity? Traits like sentience, ability to move spontaneously, and the like. So we can open with the pro-choice answer to this question.
Mainly, and
pro-life answer to this question, pardon me.
Mainly, and I'll let Moira, who is a nursing student here, I'll let her kind of take over. But I maybe just like to start with that we mainly do it because there's no point you can say after conception, there's no place that you can draw a line and say like, oh, the fetus doesn't do this. That doesn't also, you can't be consistent and say like, oh, the fetus isn't a human being, it's not living, it doesn't do this, and then also go to somebody who's living and say, who is already born, who none of us would deny is a human being, and say like, oh, you can't be consistent. Like, there's no line that you can draw where then you can be consistent, because there's always going to be someone who's alive who also doesn't have that characteristic. So you can't be consistent on it and not just speak from conception. And then I'll let Moira go from there.
Thank you, Joseph, because you summarized what I was going to say really well. I just want to go into a few more specifics. I think that the simplest way to define a living thing is that it's growing and developing. And from the moment of the meeting between a sperm and an egg, entirely new DNA is formed, a copy of which will never occur again in the history of humanity. So that fact alone, the fact that you have all of the genetic codes you're going to need from that moment until you die, perhaps at 100, means that you are at that point living. So in the case of a fetus in the womb, we tend to draw lines in different places in terms of when we say that it's alive. If we start with heartbeat, that causes a problem, as Joseph said earlier, with born humans that don't have that going on, such as a person who goes into cardiac arrest. That person is at that time fighting for their life, but probably none of us would question that we would want to do CPR, get out an AED, call a code in the hospital. That's what we do. We run codes and we save somebody's life. At that point, we don't deny whether they're a human or not. We just want to get the heart beating again. If we go with pain, which is a very common place to draw the line, that comes around 12 weeks of fetal development. There are people who live entire lives without any pain receptors. It's a very rare disease. The acronym for it is CIPA. It's called congenital insensitivity to pain and anhidrosis. It means that your nerves don't have any pain receptors in them at all. And a lot of times these people have very difficult lives and have a lot of injuries. Since you don't have any pain, you're not going to know if you break your leg. You wouldn't even know, so you could have extensive injuries and not even know it. But these people, I'd say that we probably are all on the same ground about that they are alive, that they're humans and deserve full rights. And the third place that we tend to draw the line is with sentient. And there are also humans that have different ranges of mental ability. Humans that have lots of different disorders. Down syndrome is the first that comes to my mind, where these people don't have as much intelligence per se as we would say, but they're fully human. I believe we would all agree. They're some of the most lovely people you'll ever meet. So I don't know if we can draw that line in any place and all agree upon it until you say DNA. When we have DNA, we are what we are going to be forever. All of you is you when you have DNA.
Okay, thank you very much. Would somebody from the pro-choice side care to respond?
I'd like to answer the question as well. And I think that personally, when we focus on the technicalities of where life is, instead of just leaving it up to the medical professionals, we tend to go askew. And the fact that banning abortion, and if you're a woman and if you're pregnant, you have to have the baby. I think that is re-solidifying and trying to establish a woman's purpose as an incubator or a birth giver. But we're not. We're just as capable, as equal to men in every way, and we shouldn't be subjected to that role or to deliver a child we don't want, because we didn't choose the bodies, being a woman. We didn't select male or female when we came out of the womb, and we should at least be able to choose what happens with our bodies, I believe. I think decency, morality, and questions of ethics in and of themselves are subjective and often rooted in an individual's personal beliefs, but there should never be one objective law or one standard that keeps childbearing humans of all different backgrounds, experiences, and walks of life from choosing what they want to do with their body, no matter the scenario. And in this case, it happens to be abortion. I can refer to the case Harris v. McRae, which could have overturned Roe, but it was decided by a conservative female justice at the time, Sandra Day O'Connor. And despite, upholding the Roe decision, the court just fails to accept the responsibility for its storied history in creating and maintaining these extreme class differences, ones that, despite the American dream, are caste-like in reality with little to no chance of upwards movement. And in her majority opinion, she bluntly states the lack of access to providers isn't the result of societal barriers. The Supreme Court penalized those that lack the funds to seek out an abortion, regardless of the systematic reasons behind their poverty. So when a fetus becomes viable is still disputed within the scientific community, and without consensus there, any argument against abortion comes from an individual's personal beliefs. And given that freedom of religion is protected by the First Amendment, the court should have no say in preventing access to this medical procedure, and I think we need to keep seeing it as such. And to quote other late conservative justices like Ginsburg and Scalia, who have both spoken to this point in past and more recent, 2007, 2016, respectively, and despite having fundamental differences in the way in which the Constitution should interpret this issue, they still come to the same conclusion, that the courts need to step back and we need to see it as a decision and a choice.
Okay, thank you very much. Would the pro-life side care to have the last word in this particular segment?
Yes.
Here you would.
You guys keep on bringing up this these arguments from authority where you keep on talking about like, oh, the scientists say, these justices say, and you keep on talking about how it's disputed. Well, I don't know if you can find any issue whatsoever. Maybe there's one, I don't know, but I don't know if there's any issue that's not disputed, at least a little bit. That really comes from a position of relativism, which really, if you take that to its extremes, like if a court was to decide that slavery was okay, was acceptable, that slavery was constitutional, would we say that, oh, well, hey, it's in dispute? There's people who think that slavery should be okay. Like, of course not. We'd say, like, no, we'd fight against that. And so going into today, you know, abortion, you have one party, you have some people on one side that say, hey, abortion should be legal. You have no right to decide what happens here. And another side that says, no, that's regardless of what the authority is that says it, we don't take issue with the authority. We take issue with the arguments. And so that goes into, you say like, oh, it's in dispute. Like this life is in dispute, whether or not it's living or not. Well, I question how in dispute it is when I think that it's very clear just without looking at the authorities. The data kind of shows that it's a living thing. But also, if you were unsure that something was living, shouldn't you err on the side that it is? If you were to if you're going to shoot, if you're going hunting and you're going to shoot and you think like, oh, that's a deer, then there's somebody who says, no, I think that's a person there. You probably wouldn't say like, oh, well, maybe it's a deer though, so I'm going to shoot it. Like you'd probably err on the side of, let's wait, maybe it's a human. We'll err on the side of not shoot. Let's not do abortion. Even if you weren't convinced 100% that it wasn't a living, even if you weren't convinced 100% that it was a living thing, you should maybe err on the side of caution that it is a human being.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. All right, we'll begin segment 3 here with a question for the pro-choice side. So you'll go first and last in this segment with a reply from the pro-life side in the middle. So the question is this. The argument's been made in the spirit of reproductive justice that the rights of women extend to the right of equality in reproductive health. And this may include, among other things, access to affordable health care, to affordable quality contraception, family planning services, and even universal sex education. Yet with all these services in place, couldn't one make the argument that access to abortion is therefore superfluous, with the state doing all it can to aid a woman in avoiding unwanted pregnancy through these relatively uncontroversial procedures? Surely there's no obligation on the part of the state to sanction and provide for abortion as well.
So I do think that is a future fantasy scenario. It's not currently reflected in our society. These are not issues that are as widely accepted. Access to comprehensive sex education are not as widely accepted as they should be. Those that favor pro-life, not in all cases, but in some cases, are also frequently against comprehensive access to education and contraception. A consensus that would let us entertain this question is far from reality. We have the highest infant mortality rate when compared to countries with a similar GDP, like I mentioned. African-American infants are 2.3 times as likely to die as non-Hispanic whites in infancy, and 3.8 times as likely to die from complications related to low birth weight as compared to non-Hispanic white infants. That is our reality. Former Vice President Hubert Humphrey stated that the ultimate moral test of any government is the way it treats 3 groups of its citizens. First, those in the dawn of our life, our children. Second, those in the shadows of life, are needy, are sick, and are handicapped. Third, those in the twilight of life, are elderly. As the historical homemakers of patriarchal societies, women have been the primary caretakers of these 3 groups, and they were admitted from this statement. If the treatment of these 3 groups is paramount to a government's morals, a government that fails to develop programs that ensure life and liberty to all, regardless of sex, ability, or religion, cannot be moral. Until this country lives up to the civil liberty ideals it has long espoused and tackles the myriad of other systemic societal problems that contribute to unwanted pregnancies and disproportionately affect the most vulnerable already living among us, any pro-life position is simply pro-birth.
Okay, thank you very much. Would someone from the pro-life side care to respond?
So you're talking to, when you make that statement, you're talking to 2 people, myself, a future immigration attorney, Moira Werner, a future nurse, two people who 100% agree with you that more needs to be done for the people on the fringe of society, for the migrants coming across the border, for the elderly, for the disabled, for all those groups. And you say like, oh, well, until stuff is done for them, like why should we care about the unborn? Well, I think that maybe the same could be said back to you. Until you care about the unborn, you know, the most basic right to life, how can you even begin to care about the potential right to healthcare or the, you know, ability to migrate into a nation? It really, I think that that's a non-argument to say that you need to be concerned about the people on the fringe of society who are already born, who you guys keep on phrasing it as who are already here. Well, the unborn child happens to also be already here. They're, you know, as Moira stated very nicely, they're growing. They already have their own DNA that will never be replicated. That's its own. And Moira might have more to add to that.
Well, the only thing that I would ask is specifically, Bella and Ellen, you both mentioned that we aren't entirely sure where life begins. Well, then I would ask you, at what point is it no longer okay to kill?
Okay, so I do think, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I do think there is a strong misconception over what constitutes a late-term abortion and what those normally entail. Most states have banned those. The Supreme Court did uphold a ban that would allow for that would ban partial birth abortions in 2007. The reality is when most abortion rates have been falling for the last several years, as you know, access to information about comprehensive education, access to contraceptives is increasing in certain areas. I'm so sorry, I got very heated for a second there. I think that this is still an argument over that stems from a bill keeping women under control. This is not as moral of an argument when the reality is all of these, I'm making these arguments, I'm pointing to the most vulnerable in our society, not because I don't think that you necessarily agree with that, but because that is the reality that we're living in.
Yes,
abortion is going to be around. It has been around since the beginning of humanity. It is going to be around whether it's banned or not. There are always going to be those that seek out abortions, those with power, those with mistresses, even if they are vehemently pro-life in what they are what they say and what they speak. Those with money, those with power will always have access to these types of services. So by banning them, you're not banning abortion, you are banning the equitable access to abortion. You're keeping people stuck in cycles of poverty. You are preventing education, and you are impacting, once that child is born, there are not the social services that are needed to care for it.
Yes, we're in agreement on this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll open segment 4 with a question for the pro-life side. So pro-life side will lead off, pro-choice side will have a chance to respond, and the pro-life side will then have the last word. So the question I have, according to the CDC, there were approximately 640,000 legal abortions in the United States for the year 2015, about 188 per 1,000 live births. It's a relatively safe procedure. Less than 1% of women experience major complications following a legal abortion. Were abortion prohibited, one would think a good portion of these 600,000 plus women would seek illegal abortions that are unregulated and likely far less safe. Therefore, couldn't the argument be made that prohibiting abortion may actually result in greater harm to women and perhaps greater harm overall.
So I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's always mentioned. That's always, that's a key thing, and that's a really important thing to talk about. And really it comes down to abortion. First off, abortion will never be safe. A successful abortion necessitates the death of another human being. So abortion will never be safe. And we always talk about like it being healthcare and we wanting it to be more safe, but the truth is that if abortion was really considered healthcare, wouldn't people on the pro-choice side, wouldn't the abortion facilities like Planned Parenthood be pushing for, safety precautions to be taken into consideration? Like even, just simple things that, simple requirements and regulations that go into it, such as if you were going to get an invasive surgery, any other invasive surgery, you would need to be informed about all the things that went into that, the risks that there were. But abortion facilities have gone to large extremes to get there to be no such requirements or regulations on abortion. They're trying to deregulate it so much, way more than any healthcare is in this country. So if it was really about healthcare, and it's not, it's really about making money. That's really what it is. We talk about the military industrial complex, and we talk about the prison industrial complex, and it's like those things may be really very real. But then the same people who seem to talk about those things forget that, well, there's also an abortion industrial complex. It's all about making money. It's not about the health of the mother. It's not actually about healthcare. It has nothing. It's never had anything to do with that. It's all about making money. And in fact, when Planned Parenthood was first started, it was all about exterminating the Black race. These are things that Margaret Sanger talked extensively about. And I'm sure that anything else on healthcare, Moira might have some more to add.
I have some less controversial stuff, just quick. But yeah, no, what I was going to talk about for just a second was the safety of abortion as a procedure. Yes, it's statistically very high for the women. As you said, Professor, it's less than 1% of women who have major complications from abortion from the procedure itself. However, the termination of the pregnancy before it comes to full term has caused sky-high rates in breast cancer for women. And abortions have also caused women to see up to an 81% increase in substance abuse problems and depression, because it's a very emotionally traumatic experience that both of you, Ellen and Bella, have also mentioned. We know nobody wants an abortion. It's a traumatic experience, difficult for women to go through. So the effects of that, both on a woman's body and on her psyche, can also be very detrimental.
Okay. Pro-choice side, would you care to respond?
Yeah, and I'm glad, Moira, that you brought up the traumatic experiences and the fact that, no woman wants an abortion. I completely agree with that. But I also have to say, you could say the same traumatic experiences. You could see, you do see the same, dependency on drugs, on addiction, on you do see the same mental health challenges and physical challenges with women that have carried full term. I do think that this is, again, pointing to the healthcare side of things and how we as a society treat addiction, treat mental health, and treat physical health, especially in the case of, mothers that have either terminated their pregnancy or carried that baby to full term, had it, and are not capable of caring for it. We treat these as society's problems, as things that are criminal, instead of really addressing the root cause. So I think that with access to abortion comes access to, so these facilities, kind of to Joe's point, they don't just provide abortions. It is one of the things that they provide. However, most people these days, Plan B you can buy at Target. Most people are not going to Planned Parenthood for an abortion. They are using other forms of contraception. In rural areas, these facilities, these clinics are often the only women's health center that is available for most women. So by cutting the access to that, you're cutting access to far more than abortion. And as far as the money-making thing, you could say that about anything within our society. Anything.
Okay.
Except that
Thank
Planned
you very much.
Parenthood has a quota.
Would the pro-life side like to have the last word in this segment?
Planned Parenthood has a quota, kind of how cops do with speeding tickets. Hospitals don't have a quota on elective surgeries, and clinics don't have quotas on how many patients they see from car crashes and broken legs that they fix. Specifically in terms of healthcare, I think that's probably the only example that we can find. Yes, lots of businesses are in for the money and have a quota in terms of the amount of customers they want to serve. But I think that since this is the only procedure that I can think of, you may have other examples, I'm not entirely sure, but I can think of no other medical procedures for which there are quotas. So I think that that probably sheds an ill light on the motives, perhaps, of an institution like Planned Parenthood, which is beside the point because they're not, of course, the only abortion provider. We're not here to just talk about Planned Parenthood. But in general, I would say that the fact that it is a money-making business means that it is less important to them about the health of the mother, and that the risks of an abortion do medically outweigh the risks of childbirth.
I'm so sorry. I would just like to say one thing. The entire healthcare system in this country is a for-profit system. So, I mean, realistically,
Because it's a private market.
again, we don't have to go back and forth about debating Planned Parenthood because what you said, we're not here to just debate Planned Parenthood. But I mean, you had pill mills pumping out opioids in the early 2000s. They had quotas. You have pharmaceutical reps that are pushing quotas to doctors. It might not be just like this might be a medical procedure example, but this is how our healthcare system is set up. And this is where the problem, that is where.
Yeah.
I totally.
You are saying that all the things that have quotas are bad, yes?
Okay, let's go ahead and wrap this segment up.
The system by which we operate our healthcare and access to abortion are two different things. So one is healthcare, and one is how we run our healthcare. We don't have to run it the way that we do.
Yes.
I'm not saying
Pro-life side, why don't you go ahead and get in a last word here, and then we'll close out the fourth segment.
So so I'm just gonna have a slight thing to add about talking about Planned Parenthood doing abortions and that just being one of the services they provide. If it's one of the services they provide, and we know we can look at their statements, like their income statements and stuff, we know that abortion is where they make all their money. We know that they want to sell abortions. That's what they push. But if it wasn't, if they really wanted to claim, then how about I would be happy to give them all the funding they want if they just didn't do abortions. I'd be happy to donate my own if they just didn't do abortions. Maybe they should just stop doing that. Then they'd get all the government funding from both the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this concludes the four segments, one for each side of this particular discussion. What we'd like to do now is open up the floor for questions from the audience. Our panelists requested to do that. So how I would like the questions from the audience to proceed, if you would. Use the chat feature that you have in Zoom. That way there aren't a bunch of people talking at once. Send your questions to me, and I'll relay it to the appropriate side. Let's start with a question for the pro-choice side. If you would, send that to me via chat. Always takes a second to type out a message. So if there is a question from the audience for the pro-choice side. Okay, here we have a question. This is for the pro-choice side. Scientifically, when does human life begin? Would someone from the pro-choice side like to take a crack at answering that?
Sure. Personally, and I think what is already set in stone right now, I think life begins when the life becomes viable. So when the mother isn't necessarily just the tool for it to survive, and when it survives on its own, that I think is when it becomes a life in and of itself. So um, it's really hard to say that terminating a pregnancy so early on, it's really hard to say that that is killing a human being from my perspective.
Okay, so roughly at viability, 23 or 24 weeks. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I'd like a question now for the pro-life side from someone. Please send your questions just to me. Question for the pro-life side. Okay, we have a question here. If abortion is outlawed, what other solutions or options would you give to women? Question for the pro-life side. Abortion is outlawed, what other solutions or options would you give to the women or to women?
So I think that the options would be, first actually I do want to talk about, because I'm not sure if we really addressed it. People always talk about how women would turn to back alley abortions. And I kind of just want to address that was kind of taken away from it. They used to be called backdoor abortions. The vast majority of abortions used to be done through the back door of hospitals, and the vast majority of them were done by actually licensed physicians in hospitals, and it was actually safer. But I'm not even calling that an option, because I would hope that that just wouldn't be done, obviously. So what would be the options for women? All the things that people in the pro-life community are already pushing for. We have Summit Life Outreach right here that me and Moira volunteer at consistently, that gives free clothes, free, so charity really is what I'm talking about. Charity is the answer, giving, clothes and baby bottles and really community support to these women who mothers need support from a whole community. It takes a village to raise a child.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question here for the pro-choice side. So this question is, if you as a supporter of pro-choice, if your sole or main reason for supporting Planned Parenthood, if you don't support Planned Parenthood only because Planned Parenthood supports abortion, why wouldn't you also support the federally qualified health clinics that don't support abortions?
That was a question for the pro-life side?
For the pro-choice side.
Oh, that was a question for the pro-choice side.
I mean, personally, I would support more federal free clinics. I do believe that the bodily autonomy that men possess continues to evade women. Any gains that we make are met with backlash, sometimes legally and often socially. I believe that men have long used pregnancy as a means to exert their power over women. So I fully believe that at the heart of this is not necessarily a question of life, but a question of power, power balance, and a power imbalance. I would support more access to healthcare. I just think that at the end of the day, these are going to occur whether or not we are okay with it personally. So I do think that this, at the end of the day, it needs to be a woman's choice.
Okay, thank you. All right, could we get another question from the audience for the pro-life side? Any other questions for the audience? Questions from the audience for the pro-life side? Okay.
I would like to, if we don't have any, do we have a question?
Yes, we do. I'm just reading it real quick. All right, so this question for the pro-life side. So if abortions are an act that kills a living being by presenting its life, wouldn't contraceptives be in the same category of, the supposed unauthorized killing as an abortion? After all, sperm and eggs, respectively, are alive.
Absolutely not, would be my response. We don't say that we're committing mass murder every time we have a period. We shed an egg every month, probably more than one. Most girls have like 2 or 3. And in the case of guys, their bodies are producing sperm constantly. A sperm by itself is not a person any more than just if you cut your fingernails. And the same thing with an egg by itself. So contraception is definitely an option that the pro-life position can support. That's more of a personal beliefs issue, but from an ethical standpoint, you really cannot oppose it. Contraception that does not terminate a zygote is fully morally permissible.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question for the audience, or from the audience rather, for the pro-choice side. Okay, so this question for the pro-choice side is, with the advancement of medical technology, babies have been able to survive earlier and earlier in births. In other words, viability seems to be, I guess, pushed back in time closer to conception. Does this mean that new laws making abortion illegal at earlier weeks would now be permitted to be passed as healthcare becomes better able to take care of, I guess, fetuses at earlier stages of development?
Okay. So I still think that we are really focused on this question of when is a fetus viable. And I don't think that there's still not enough consensus within the scientific community on this. I think we still have to focus on the lives that are being affected daily by not having access to preventative healthcare, to education, those that lack the resources to seek out abortion. So I think that, to be quite frank, I think that the topic of abortion is a talking point because it is so, because people do have such passionate beliefs on either side. However, when you look at the reality of the healthcare system within this country, it is such a small piece of that is so indicative of much bigger problems. We still, you can still be quitting a job, having to leave a job because they don't accept your pregnancy, or that you won't have access to childcare, is still considered a voluntary loss of income in this country. Until we address things like that, and until the scientific community can come to a better consensus on when, a fetus will feel pain or when it is fully viable outside of the womb. Yes, they're coming earlier and earlier, but the science is still developing so much. Until we have those things there for those scientific pieces there for certain, we need to be focusing on the humans that are alive right now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we have another question here for the pro-life side. This is, I suppose, a question about statistics. One member of the audience was wondering where you were getting the information that Planned Parenthood makes use of abortion quotas. And then after this, we'll have one more question for each side. So go ahead.
We're getting that information from people who work at Planned Parenthood facilities who have come out and said it. Both people who currently work there as well as people who have left. I would say Abby Johnson comes to mind, but I know some people might say that she's lying or things like that. But we have many more people who currently work there will admit to this. It's not something that's usually denied. If you go to a meeting at it's not generally something that that Planned Parenthood would even necessarily deny unless they were specifically trying to hide that.
No, but I think it is a fair question, because I do think it's a point that's come up quite a bit that tends to get overblown. And there is a lot of misinformation that goes around about the quotas. Quite a bit of it has been fact-checked and unproven.
How has it been unproven?
Great. So if we want to look at Snopes or other fact-checking websites, you can search this and it will say it's unproven.
So they might, but again, like I don't like argument. I don't think that arguments from authority are necessarily the thing. I think that you can simply go to, like, if there's simply enough people who have the information that's out there, simply shows that we know that Planned Parenthoods, because they've sent memos that we've gotten a hold of, or that have been made public, where they actually tell their people that they're really, that who, you know, when a woman goes into Planned Parenthood, they talk to somebody there. And we know that if they're pregnant, they, and we have videos of this, and the people who've left, again, they are very open about this. They talk, they're always trying to sell. They will not try and sell. Now, there are cases where they will, where some people will, but as a general rule, they're trying to sell and push abortions to these young women. You can read Planned Parenthood's own records. Like, I don't know if necessarily the authority of a fact-checking website would necessarily get you to not believe what Planned Parenthood has themselves put out.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers to that question. All right, so I'd like to, we have plenty of questions here already on chat. Thanks to everybody who submitted them. I'd like to direct one more question to each side, starting with the pro-choice side. Where the heck was it? Okay, another question from the audience for the pro-choice side. So far you've argued, you collectively, have argued that society should protect our most vulnerable people. Who is more vulnerable than an unborn fetus? This is a question for the pro-choice side. And then we'll have one more for the pro-life side. Who would like to take that one?
I got it. Okay. I'm reading the question, I'm sorry. So who is more vulnerable than the woman that has been violated, has lost the autonomy of her own body, and then is forced to carry this full term? I think that when you're talking about living, breathing, sentient human beings, that is the thing that you would find more in the more vulnerable state. And I think that when you consider that the historical significance of abortion and of as it relates to the women's empowerment movements, this is where you find this. Like, with patience, purity has long been a standard that women are expected to uphold, despite men having no such standard. If a woman wants to express her sexuality by engaging in premarital sex, she is the one that's expected to bear the consequences of those actions. So I think that the argument that the fetus is the one that is the most vulnerable completely ignores the epidemic of violence against women in this country. It completely ignores the estimated 800,000 rapes in 2018. Not to mention those that might be seeking an abortion due to an abusive or domestic violence relationship. So I really just don't think you can't separate out one singular aspect of a woman's fertility and deem it not within a woman's control because the fetus she's carrying might be more vulnerable than her. Its concerns are medical. It requires adequate health care with the same privacy concerns as any other medical condition. This is, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, can I just ask, how is it violence against the women if it was a consensual experience? We're not even debating here the rape situation that accounts for about 1.5% of all abortions. If she was fully into it, chose and decided to have sex, and with or without contraception, I don't see the violence.
Because a woman can consent to sex and not consent to being impregnated. And being
Can you consent to jumping in the pool and not consent to getting wet?
There are also cases where even they do still use contraceptives and contraceptives can fail. And when it's not the woman's intent to get pregnant, she shouldn't have to continue with the pregnancy. That's not something she ever signed up for. That's why it's really hard to even aim to draw a line between rape and consent when a woman can consent and take it back for not only the sexual experience, but for the intent to get pregnant. And if the male or if the other partner really wants the child to be born, there are plenty of other women who want to have children. You should not subject that one woman to. It's not a fair thing to say that when a woman has sex and gets pregnant, then she should follow through with it, because I'm sorry, but most of the population has casual sex and does not want to have a pregnancy from it. And that is not the only purpose of sex.
Thank you very much. We have one more question for the pro-life side, and then we can go ahead and conclude this discussion. So, where the hell was it? Okay, so the question for the pro-life side, do you support, I guess, the abolition pro-life movement, presumably to restrict, all abortions as soon as possible? Do you support the abolition pro-life movement, or should we continue on the more incremental approach to overturning Roe versus Wade?
So my view, at least, is that it is a child, a person, a human being from conception to natural death. I am absolutely in favor of ending the intentional killing of any human being, which I don't consider being against the killing of a child in the womb to be mutually exclusive to also being opposed to the killing or any other vulnerable population, which I would also look to support. And then, as I've said, not the absolute necessarily abolition of the procedure that might be necessary if the mother's life was in danger, just to clarify that.
Give me 1 second, Joe. Joseph, 1 second. Guys, let's please keep the discussion private on chat. All of the panelists can see what you're posting there as they're trying to make their points. Please keep the discussions private. Joseph, go ahead, continue.
So again, so I am absolutely in favor of abolishing abortion in all cases, except for when the life of the mother is in danger from conception and all the way, and at conception is the point that I draw that to be a human life.
Okay. All right, one last thing here on chat. We have a remark from a faculty member. Begins, not really a question. Oh, sorry, then, we're not going to bother with it. No, just kidding. Somebody wanted to chime in that just wanted to relay how impressed they were with the panelists. It's an extremely sensitive topic, and all four of our panelists discussed it thoughtfully and respectively. It wasn't me that said this, but I would have to concur wholeheartedly. I think all four of our panelists today did a hell of a job. And I'd like to thank the four of you for taking the time to prepare for this, for putting yourselves out there, in responding to questions and these arguments. So on behalf of our panelists today, Joseph Tricarico, Isabella Aiu, Ellen Rajnisz, and Moira Werner, I'm Mike Walsh. Many thanks to everybody for being here today. I hope you got something out of it. And we can go ahead and conclude the forum now.
Thank you for having us.
No problem.
Thank you, Professor.